6,547 heads in 9 months. How the guillotine turned France into a slaughterhouse. The air in Paris during the sweltering July of 1794 does not smell of revolution anymore. It smells of copper, hot iron, and the sickly sweet stench of decay that no amount of summer rain can wash away. If you walk through the Place de la Révolution, your boots don't click against the cobblestones. They stick. The earth has drunk so much blood that it has become a dark, permanent mire. This is the height of the Great Terror, a period where the dream of liberty has been replaced by the mechanical rhythm of the falling blade. At the center of this crimson whirlwind stands a man who does not look like a butcher. He is small, meticulous, and always impeccably dressed in a sky-blue coat with his wig powdered to a perfect snowy white. His name is Maximilien Robespierre, known to the masses as the Incorruptible. To him, the guillotine is not an instrument of murder. It is a surgical tool, and France is a patient that requires a massive, unrelenting hemorrhage to survive. But what Robespierre has failed to realize is that the machine he perfected has no master. It is a hungry god of wood and steel, and in the next 9 months it will claim 6,547 lives before it finally turns its cold, triangular gaze toward the man who kept it fed. To understand how a nation that began by shouting for brotherhood ended up drowning in its own blood, you have to look into the eyes of Robespierre as he sits in his small room at the house of the carpenter Maurice Duplay. He is a man of logic, a man of virtue, and a man of terrifyingly narrow vision. By 1794, the French Revolution is no longer about bread or taxes. It has become a religious crusade for a secular utopia. Robespierre believes that for a republic to be born, the old world must not just die, it must be erased. He sits at his desk, the scratching of his quill the only sound in the room, as he signs name after name onto the lists of the condemned. He does not see faces. He sees obstacles to virtue. He believes that terror is nothing more than justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. In his mind there is no middle ground. You are either a pure citizen of the Republic, or you are a traitor who must be shortened by a head. This logic has turned Paris into a high-speed factory of death, a slaughterhouse of the soul where the line between a hero and a victim is thinner than the edge of a razor. The guillotine itself has become the most famous resident of the city, invented by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine as a humane alternative to the messy, agonizing executions of the past. It was supposed to be a symbol of equality. Even in death, the citizen would be equal. No more breaking on the wheel for the poor or the axe for the rich. Just one swift democratic click-clack. But by the year 2 of the revolutionary calendar, the machine has surpassed its creator's intent. It has become an industry. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, is the busiest man in France, overseeing a team that has turned the act of killing into a timed performance. They can now process dozens of people in less than 30 minutes. The carts, known as tumbrils, rattle through the streets every afternoon, carrying their batches or fournées to the scaffold. The people of Paris, who once cheered the fall of kings, now watch in a state of stunned, rhythmic apathy. They see the seamstress sitting next to the duke, the priest next to the soldier, all moving toward the same wooden planks. The numbers are staggering. In just 9 months, the death toll climbs to 6,547 in Paris alone. That is more than 20 people a day, every day, without pause. But the real horror of 1794 isn't just the quantity of the dead, it's the absolute lack of a reason. The revolution has begun to turn inward, like a starving animal devouring its own limbs. Robespierre and his Committee of Public Safety have cleared away the monarchy, the aristocrats, and the rebellious priests. Now they are looking for the hidden enemies. The paranoia is a fog that covers the city. You can be sent to the conciergerie, the antechamber of the guillotine, for any reason or no reason at all. Saying monsieur instead of citizen is a death warrant. Complaining about the price of bread is sabotage. Crying at the execution of a friend is a conspiracy against the public morale. The law of suspects has made it so that not acting enthusiastic enough about the revolution is a crime. People stop speaking in the streets. They stop looking each other in the eye. Everyone is a potential informant, and every informant is a potential victim. The conciergerie is overflowing, its damp, dark cells packed with people from every walk of life, waiting for their names to be called in the morning roll call, the Journal of the Dead. In the middle of this suffocating atmosphere, Robespierre makes his most ambitious and fatal move. He believes the terror is moving too slowly. The legal system, even the revolutionary one, is too bogged down by things like evidence and defense. On the 22nd of Prairial, he introduces a law that effectively strips the world of its sanity, the Law of 22. Prairial decrees that for enemies of the people there shall be no more defense lawyers. There will be no more cross-examination of witnesses. The only possible verdicts for the accused are acquittal or death, and since the Revolutionary Tribunal is staffed by Robespierre's hand-picked loyalists, acquittal is a ghost that rarely haunts the courtroom. This law is the catalyst for the Great Terror. It is the moment the slaughterhouse switches to 24-hour production. In the weeks following this law, the number of executions triples. The blade falls so often that the wood of the scaffold becomes permanently stained, a deep bruised purple. The smell of the blood in the summer heat becomes so unbearable that residents of the Rue Saint-Honoré protest, not against the killings, but against the stench and the health hazards of the open gutters of gore. Robespierre is at the height of his power, but he is also at the height of his isolation. He has become a godlike figure presiding over the festival of the Supreme Being, standing atop a man-made mountain in a blue coat, declaring a new religion of reason. To his colleagues in the National Convention, he is no longer a leader, he is a threat. They look at the empty chairs of their friends who have already been shortened, and they realize that the Law of 22 Prairial was not just meant for the aristocrats, it was meant for them. The incorruptible has become the inescapable. Every time he speaks from the tribune, he mentions traitors and conspirators without naming them. He keeps a small, neat notebook in his pocket, and everyone in the room is convinced their name is written inside it. This is the irony of the slaughterhouse. By making everyone afraid for their lives, Robespierre has inadvertently created a brotherhood of the terrified. The tension reaches a breaking point on a day that history will remember as the 8th of Thermidor. Robespierre ascends the podium of the convention. He has been absent for weeks, brooding in his room, and his return is met with a heavy, expectant silence. For 2 hours he delivers a rambling, apocalyptic speech. He speaks of a conspiracy against public liberty and claims that there are traitors within the Committee of Public Safety and the convention itself. But he refuses to name them. He tells the room that the purification must continue. As he speaks, he looks out over a sea of faces, men like Fouché, Tallien, and Barras, men who have their own blood-stained hands and know that if they don't kill Robespierre tonight, they will be in the tumbrils tomorrow morning. Robespierre thinks he is being clever, keeping them in suspense, maintaining his power through the sheer weight of their fear. He doesn't realize that he has just committed the one sin a tyrant cannot survive. He has given his enemies no choice but to fight. That night, the halls of the convention are filled with whispers. The very laws Robespierre designed to protect the Republic are now the walls of his own cage. The Law of 22 Prairial, which removed the need for evidence, means that he himself can be condemned on a whim. The secret list he hinted at has become his own death warrant. His allies are deserting him, not out of a sudden love for justice, but out of a desperate primal need to stay alive. They spent the night plotting, coordinating, and shivering in the dark. knowing that the sun of the next day, the 9th of Thermidor, would either see the end of the terror or the end of their lives. In the shadows of the Palais Royal, the gears of the coup begin to turn, mirroring the cold mechanical gears of the guillotine that waits in the square. The man who believed he was the architect of a new world is about to find out that the foundation of his utopia is made of sand and bone, and the tide is finally coming in. The morning of July 27th, 1794, dawned with a heat that felt like a physical weight pressing down on the city of Paris. It was the 9th of Thermidor by the new calendar, a day that should have been just another cycle in the gears of the Republic, another day of paperwork and purges. But as the sun rose over the slate roofs and the muddy banks of the Seine, the atmosphere inside the National Convention was electric, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the sharp metallic tang of fear. The men gathered in that hall were not heroes of a grand epic. They were terrified animals backed into a corner. For months they had lived under the shadow of Maximilien Robespierre's finger, watching as he pointed it at one colleague after another, sending them to the national razor. They had seen Danton, the lion of the revolution, plead for mercy and find none. They had seen Desmoulins, the voice of the streets, weep as he was dragged to the scaffold. Now they knew that if they did not act before the sun set, many of them would be sleeping in a communal pit of lime by the following evening. Robespierre entered the hall with his usual composed, almost ghostly gait. He was the personification of the law, a man who believed so deeply in his own righteousness that he had lost the ability to see the humanity in his victims. He took his seat, his eyes scanning the room through his spectacles, perhaps looking for the next names to add to his notebook. Beside him sat Saint-Just, the angel of death, a young man of chilling beauty and even colder conviction, preparing a speech that would likely condemn half the room. They believed they were untouchable because they were the keepers of the general will. What they did not see were the trembling hands of the deputies around them, clutching concealed daggers and crumpled notes. The situation had shifted from a political debate into a primal struggle for survival. The incorruptible had made the fatal mistake of threatening everyone without naming anyone, and in doing so, he had united his enemies in a way that no ideology ever could. The session began not with the usual respectful silence, but with a roar. When Saint-Just stood up to speak, he was immediately drowned out by a chorus of planned interruptions. This was the first obstacle, the first crack in the facade of Robespierre's total control. For the first time in years, the machinery of the state refused to move for its master. The deputies began to shout, "Down with the tyrant!" and "Liberty or death!" The noise was a physical wall, pushing back against the two men on the podium. Robespierre, shocked by this sudden defiance, rushed to the tribune, his face turning a pale, sickly grey. He tried to speak, to use the weapon that had built his empire, his voice, but the room would not let him. Every time he opened his mouth, the bell of the convention's president rang out like a funeral knell, silencing him. He turned from the left to the right, pleading with the mountain and the plain, but he found only cold, vengeful eyes. It was a psychological collapse captured in real time. The man who had sent thousands to their deaths with a whisper was now being strangled by the collective roar of those he had terrified. In that moment, Robespierre must have felt the world tilting on its axis. Internal monologue is a luxury for those who think they have time, but for Maximilien, the thoughts must have been a frantic blur of betrayal and disbelief. How could the people's representatives turn on the people's servant? He looked at the men shouting at him, men he knew were corrupt, men he knew had profited from the revolution, and he saw the monstrous irony of his own creation. He had built a system where accusation was proof, and now he was the one being accused. "The blood of Danton chokes him," someone screamed from the back of the hall. The words struck him like a physical blow. He gasped for air, his voice cracking, his throat dry with the dust of the hall, and the sudden realization of his own mortality. He was no longer the soul of the Republic. He was just a man in a blue coat, suddenly very small and very alone in a room full of wolves. The decree of arrest was passed with a speed that felt like a falling blade. Along with his brother Augustin, Saint-Just and a few others, Robespierre was seized by the very guards who had protected him only hours before. But the drama of the 9th of Thermidor was far from over. As they were being led away, the Paris Commune, the radical heart of the city's government, remained loyal to him. They intercepted the prisoners and brought them to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall. This was the turning point, the moment where the revolution could have tipped into a full-scale civil war. For a few hours that night, the city held its breath. The bells of the churches began to ring the tocsin, the sound that usually signaled a popular uprising. Robespierre sat in the grand hall of the Hôtel de Ville, surrounded by his supporters, with the heavy weight of a decision pressing on him. He had the power to sign an order for the National Guard to march on the Convention, to crush his enemies and reclaim his throne. But here, the man of law became his own greatest enemy. Robespierre hesitated. He was a man of the pen, not the sword. To sign an illegal order to attack the national representatives went against every fiber of his legalistic soul. He spent the night in a state of paralysis, debating the constitutionality of his own survival while the world outside moved to destroy him. While he hesitated, the National Convention acted. They declared him hors-la-loi, an outlaw. This was the most terrifying sentence the revolution could produce. Being an outlaw meant that you had no right to a trial. You didn't need a jury or an indictment. Your identity was confirmed, and you were executed within 24 hours. The law he had used to strip others of their defense had now been turned into a weapon that stripped him of his life. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the support of the Paris masses began to evaporate. The sans-culottes, the working-class radicals who had been the backbone of the terror, were tired. They were hungry, they were disillusioned, and they were weary of the constant smell of blood. They didn't come to the Hôtel de Ville in the thousands as they had in the past. They stayed in their homes, listening to the rain that had finally started to fall, washing the dust from the streets but leaving the blood in the cracks of the stones. When the troops of the Convention, led by Barras, finally approached the Hôtel de Ville, they found a scene of total collapse. There was no heroic last stand. There was only the sound of desperation. Inside the building, the realization of the end had set in. Augustin Robespierre threw himself out of a window, landing on the stone steps below with a sickening crunch of bone, yet surviving in agony. Lebas, another loyalist, put a pistol to his head and ended his life instantly. Saint-Just, perhaps the most tragic and terrifying of them all, stood still, his arms crossed, watching the doors with a cold, aristocratic indifference, waiting for the end he had always known would come. And then there was Maximilien. As the soldiers burst into the room, a shot rang out. To this day, historians debate whether it was a botched suicide attempt or a shot fired by a young gendarme named Merda, but the result was horrific. The bullet shattered Robespierre's jaw, tearing through his cheek and lodging in the roof of his mouth. He did not die. He fell across the table, his powdered wig stained with a sudden dark crimson, his sky-blue coat ruined. The man who had lived by the word had been literally silenced. He could no longer speak, no longer argue, no longer plead. He was a broken, bleeding piece of humanity, held together by a dirty bandage that the soldiers wrapped around his head to keep his jaw from falling off. They carried him back to the Committee of Public Safety, the very place where he had ruled France, and laid him on a wooden table. For hours he lay there in the flickering candlelight, the object of mockery and insults from the people who had trembled at his name that morning. People came to stare at him as if he were a captured beast in a cage. He remained silent, his eyes wide and filled with an unreadable expression, perhaps pain, perhaps regret, or perhaps the ultimate realization that the machine he had built was finally, perfectly doing its job. The 6,547 deaths he had overseen were just a prelude to this one. The slaughterhouse was ready for its final, most important guest. The sun rose on the 10th of Thermidor, like a witness summoned to a crime scene. It was a brutal, unforgiving light that offered no mercy to the man lying on a wooden table in the room of the Committee of Public Safety. Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the Republic of Virtue, was no longer a man of words. He was a shattered vessel of bone and blood. His jaw, held together by a crude, gore-soaked bandage, throbbed with every heartbeat, a rhythmic reminder of his failed attempt to escape the destiny he had crafted for so many others. For hours he had endured the stares and the mockery of his former colleagues. They leaned over him, blowing tobacco smoke into his face, asking him if his supreme being would descend to save him now. He could only stare back with eyes that burned with a mixture of agony and a lingering, frozen defiance. He was an outlaw now, a status that stripped him of the very thing he had once used to dominate France, the right to speak. By the afternoon, the administrative formalities were complete. Because he had been declared outside the law, there was no need for a trial, no need for evidence, and no need for a defense. The irony was absolute. The man who had stripped the citizens of France of their legal protections through the law of 22 Prairial was now being swept away by the same legal vacuum. The Revolutionary Tribunal, which had become a conveyor belt for the dead under his influence, simply confirmed his identity. The paperwork was signed with the efficiency that Robespierre himself would have admired. The order was given. The batch of the 10th of Thermidor would consist of 22 men, including the paralyzed Couthon and the silent, brooding Saint-Just. They were to be taken to the Place de la Révolution at once. The journey began in the courtyard of the Conciergerie. The tumbrils, the heavy, open wooden carts that had become the city's most feared vehicles, waited in the heat. As Robespierre was hoisted into the cart, the crowd began to gather. This was not the usual crowd of bored spectators. This was a city exhaling a breath it had held for 2 years. The streets were packed, from the windows of the Rue Saint-Honoré to the very tops of the lampposts. People climbed onto roofs just to catch a glimpse of the incorruptible in his moment of total humiliation. The air was filled with a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a roar. It was a collective scream of release. Women who had lost their husbands, children who had lost their parents, and men who had lived every day in fear of the knock on the door, they all came to see the man who had personified their terror. The carts moved with an agonizing slowness. Every jolt of the wooden wheels on the cobblestones sent a fresh wave of white-hot pain through Robespierre's shattered face. He sat as upright as he could, his eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to look at the people who were throwing mud and insults at him. A woman jumped onto the side of the cart, clutching the wooden railing, and screamed directly into his ear, "Go down to hell with the curses of all the mothers of France." He did not blink. He was already dead in every way that mattered. His body was simply catching up to his soul. Beside him, Saint-Just remained as stoic as a marble statue, watching the chaos with a look of profound contempt. They had tried to build a paradise out of blood, and they were finally realizing that blood only ever builds a grave. As the procession turned into the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine came into view. It stood tall and indifferent against the summer sky, its blade catching the light like a silver tooth. This was the stage where King Louis XVI had died, where Marie Antoinette had met her end, and where Danton had uttered his final booming boast. Now it was waiting for its master. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, stood at the top of the steps, a man who had become a mechanical extension of the state's will. He had executed thousands under Robespierre's orders, and he would execute Robespierre with the same professional detachment. To the blade, there is no difference between a king and a revolutionary. There is only the neck and the steel. One by one, Robespierre's companions were led up the steps. The sound of the blade falling, that heavy, sickening thud, followed by the splash of blood into the basket, echoed across the square 21 times. Each time the blade fell, the crowd erupted in a frenzy of joy. Couthon was carried up in his chair, his crippled legs making the process difficult for the executioners. Saint-Just walked up the steps with the grace of a man going to a wedding, never uttering a word. He was the last. It was a deliberate choice by his enemies to make him watch every one of his friends die, to ensure that he felt the full weight of his failure before the end. When Robespierre was lifted from the cart, he could barely stand. 2 men supported him as he walked toward the stairs of the scaffold. The crowd went silent for a moment, a sudden heavy hush falling over the square. As he reached the top, Sanson stepped forward. To prepare the neck for the blade, the executioner had to remove the bandage that was holding Robespierre's jaw in place. With a swift, brutal movement, Sanson ripped the blood-caked linen away. The silence of the square was shattered by a sound that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. It was a scream of primal animalistic agony, the sound of a man whose face was literally falling apart. A scream that seemed to contain all the pain and horror of the last 9 months. The executioners moved quickly now. They strapped him to the vertical plank, the bascula, and tilted him forward. His head was placed into the lunette, the wooden collar that held the neck in place. For a few seconds, Robespierre looked down into the basket, seeing the severed heads of his friends, smelling the copper scent of the blood that had become the only currency of his republic. He closed his eyes. Sanson pulled the lever. The heavy iron blade, weighted with lead, slid down its tracks with a hiss. The click-clack of the mechanism was the last thing Maximilien Robespierre ever heard. The blade fell, and the head of the incorruptible was severed in a single, clean stroke. Sanson reached into the basket, grabbed the head by the hair, and held it high for the crowd to see. The square exploded. People hugged each other, danced in the streets, and wept with a joy that was indistinguishable from madness. The terror was over. The man who had tried to feed the guillotine until it created a utopia had finally become its final meal. The 6,547th head had fallen, and with it, the fever that had gripped France began to break. In the days that followed, the prisons of Paris were opened. Thousands of people who had been waiting for death were suddenly told they were free. The streets that had been silent and fearful were once again filled with the sounds of life, though it was a scarred and weary life. The National Convention quickly dismantled the Committee of Public Safety and repealed the Law of 22 Prairial. They blamed everything on Robespierre, turning him into a monster to hide their own complicity in the slaughter. They called it justice, but in reality, it was survival. The survivors moved on, but the shadow of the guillotine remained, a permanent scar on the soul of the nation. Robespierre's body, along with those of his companions, was taken to the Erency cemetery. There they were thrown into a common pit and covered with quicklime, ensuring that no trace of them would remain to be worshipped or remembered. He wanted to be the soul of France, but he ended as a pile of dissolving bone in an unmarked grave. His story is the ultimate warning of the cost of ideological purity. He believed that the ends justified the means, that a perfect world could be built on a foundation of corpses, and that terror was a necessary companion to virtue. He learned too late that once you start the engine of mass execution, you lose the power to stop it. The guillotine does not recognize the difference between the judge and the judged. It only recognizes the gravity of the blade. The French Revolution would continue for years, eventually giving way to the rise of Napoleon and a new kind of empire. But the Great Terror would remain its most terrifying chapter. It was a period that proved that when a nation abandons the rule of law in favor of the rule of fear, no one is safe. Not even the man who holds the key to the cage. Maximilien Robespierre began his career as a lawyer who hated the death penalty, and he ended it as the greatest executioner in his country's history. He was a man who loved humanity but hated people, a man who sought to save the Republic and ended up nearly drowning it in a sea of blood. In the end, the guillotine didn't just take his head. It took his legacy, leaving behind only the cold, mechanical memory of 6,547 lives lost in a desperate, failed attempt to force the world to be perfect. The slaughterhouse was finally closed, but the echoes of the falling blade would ring through history forever, a reminder that the path to a promised land is often paved with the very things we claim to despise.